All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly massive macroeconomic shift that India is undertaking right now with its fuel supply. We're looking at a fundamental, ground-up transformation of what actually goes into the gas tanks of millions of vehicles across the country. And as you might expect, balancing the urgent need for national energy security against the immediate realities facing everyday consumers and farmers is causing some serious friction on the ground. Here's our roadmap for today. First, India's strategic fuel problem. Second, the E20 ethanol roadmap. Third, engine troubles and mileage drops. Fourth, the food versus fuel debate. And finally, public and legal pushback. So let's start with Section 1, India's strategic fuel problem and the cost of crude. To really get why the government is pushing this policy so intensely, we have to look at a massive vulnerability at the heart of the Indian economy. Get this. Nearly 90% of the crude oil consumed in India comes from overseas. 90%. That is a staggering figure, and it represents an enormous strategic and economic liability for a rapidly growing nation. When you rely that heavily on imports, you are completely at the mercy of global forces. And that reliance has a domino effect. Every single time there's a disruption in West Asia or a random spike in global oil prices, it directly translates to local inflation. A depreciating rupee hits government finances hard, and ultimately it drains household budgets. So reducing this dependence is a pretty sensible, indisputable policy goal. By shifting to domestically produced ethanol, the government estimates it can save a massive $4 billion. That's roughly 30,000 crore rupees every single year.
Moving right along to Section 2, the E20 ethanol roadmap, accelerating to 2025.
This right here is the official blueprint. It was authored by NITI Aayog and the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, and it lays out an aggressive multi-ministry rollout. The goal? To push India toward a 20% ethanol-blended petrol. If you've been following this space, you'll know this blend is universally referred to as E20. Now, what's wild here is how incredibly fast this timeline advances. Pilot projects for a mere 5% blend began way back in 2001, but the momentum has absolutely surged lately. The government hit its 10% blending target, E10, in 2022. But then they actually advanced the target for the 20% blend. The goal is now a pan-India rollout of E20 by 2025. For a nation of this size, that is a highly accelerated timeline. And to hit that 2025 target, we are talking about some colossal logistical steps. It's not just about mixing two liquids together, it's about building entirely new supply chains from the ground up. The country literally needs to augment its total distillation capacity to 1,500 crore liters. To make that happen, the government is throwing in financial incentives, like interest subventions to build new molasses and grain-based distilleries. Meanwhile, oil marketing companies have to drastically upgrade their storage tanks and logistics networks nationwide. Which brings us to Section 3. Engine troubles, mileage drops, and the consumer reality. This is exactly where macro policy crashes into micro reality. Consumers are discovering the slightly bitter irony of a policy designed to save the national economy that might just end up stalling their own cars. The government's own roadmap actually acknowledges a significant drop in fuel efficiency, simply because ethanol has a lower calorific value than pure petrol. Four-wheelers designed for unblended petrol could see a 6.5% drop in mileage. Two-wheelers might see a 3.5% drop. Heck, even vehicles calibrated for E10 see a slight dip. For the daily commuter, this translates to getting fewer kilometers per liter and effectively paying more money to travel the exact same distance. But wait, it gets a bit more complicated. On top of the mileage loss, there is a critical engineering hurdle known as material compatibility. You see, ethanol acts as a solvent. In older vehicles that just weren't designed for it, E20 fuel can literally degrade the rubber, plastics, and elastomers inside the fuel system. Over time, that potentially leads to serious engine wear or totally stalled parts. Predictably, as motorists began filling up with this newly blended fuel, many started noticing these exact issues. They took to social media and the press, complaining loudly about the dropping numbers on their dashboard mileage displays. What started as a highly technical policy shift very quickly turned into a heated public debate. And that pushback reached the highest levels of government. When asked by the media about plummeting mileage, Road Transport Minister Nitin Gadkari argued that average owners basically cannot accurately measure fuel efficiency themselves using just a dashboard display. He stated that only manufacturer-authorized testing equipment provides accurate readings. But, of course, consumers continue to point out the very real, very immediate impact they're feeling in their wallets every time they hit the pump.
Let's shift gears now to Section 4, the food versus fuel debate, and how this is reshaping agriculture.
Because the ripple effects of this policy go far beyond the petrol pump. To meet those aggressive 2025 goals, the government heavily incentivized grain-based ethanol, particularly from maize. Now, traditionally, the poultry and cattle feed industries consume the lion's share of India's maize, about 65 to 70%. But overnight, they're facing a massive new competitor. The biofuel industry is snapping up supplies, driven by much higher fixed procurement prices. This shift is actually so pronounced that the government's own economic survey for 2025-26 flagged it as an early warning sign. Farmers in states like Maharashtra and Karnataka are actively replacing essential crops like pulses and oilseeds with maize, simply because the ethanol program guarantees them a much better price. But here's the catch. This agricultural shift threatens to increase India's dependence on edible oil imports and is already triggering shortages for the livestock industry. So what we have here is a head-on collision between two absolutely critical forms of self-reliance, or Aatmanirbharta. On one hand, you have the drive for energy self-reliance, protecting the broader economy from global oil shocks. But on the other hand, you have the fundamental need for food self-reliance, ensuring we have enough domestic crops to prevent runaway food inflation. It's a really tough balancing act. Okay, bringing it all together with Section 5, public and legal pushback and the demand for choice. Right now, petrol dealers are facing the immediate ugly brunt of this transition. The Odisha Petroleum Dealers Association actually went so far as to publicly request a review of the E20 rollout. Why? Because angry customers dealing with jammed carburetors in older vehicles are taking it out on them. The dealers are totally caught in the middle. They're selling a government-mandated fuel, but they are the ones facing the wrath of drivers whose cars are breaking down. They've officially requested a return to the E10 blend, at least until vehicle compatibility catches up. But rolling back isn't that simple. Proponents of the mandate argue that public sector banks have already financed nearly 1 lakh crore rupees in ethanol plants and logistics. Reverting to E10 now would effectively strand a truly massive historic investment. Critics, however, are calling this a classic sunk cost fallacy. They argue that this mindset completely ignores the massive financial investments that everyday auto buyers have already made in their legacy vehicles and the ongoing repair and fuel costs they are now being forced to absorb. All this frustration over a glaring lack of consumer choice has finally culminated in a public interest litigation, a PIL, filed right in the Supreme Court. The petitioners are demanding some basic transparency, like actually displaying the exact ethanol percentage on fuel nozzles and printed bills. They also want strict protections so consumers aren't suddenly denied vehicle warranties just because the state failed to provide an alternative unblended fuel choice. Furthermore, they are calling for an independent expert committee to thoroughly review the entire program's impact. Which brings us to the core dilemma of this whole explainer. As the 2025 mandate rapidly approaches, we have to look at the big picture. Yes, the economic and strategic necessity of cutting oil imports is crystal clear, but we have to ask, is the vital price of national energy independence worth the immediate tangible costs to consumer wallets, engine longevity, and food security? Was this massive transition designed to carry the public along, or does it simply expect them to silently absorb the friction of progress? It's definitely some food for thought for the next time you pull up to the pump. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.